Welcome. My name is Birga.
And I'm Gary.
And this is Curiosity, Not Judgment. Welcome to this video cast / podcast. Glad to have you along for the ride. In episode 80, if you want to go back and listen to that, I shared a little bit about a diagnosis that I've received. And so I'm going through a battery of testing to work through the process of what comes next. But as Gary knows firsthand from a cancer diagnosis in his 40s, whenever you are faced with your own mortality, whether it is just by fear of what could come or the reality of a hard and fast timeline diagnosis, we start really thinking about prioritizing our time, what we want to do with it, and how do we make the most of our time. And so I'm certainly not of the mindset, I'm not being morbid, I'm not assuming the worst, I'm actually assuming the best. However, it just gets us thinking about time and how we spend it. And whether you've got a reduced timeline based on what you had believed all along, or perhaps you've got all the time in the world, or so you think, how are you using your time?
And using your time, and what decisions are you making, and how is your worldview changing? I'll never forget when I was in the middle of my cancer diagnosis, which was looking grave for a while. I was selling a house in Corrales. Corrales is a suburb of Albuquerque. And there was this guy from out of state that was coming in that made the offer on the house that we were in the middle of accepting. And this guy was from Boston. Doesn't matter where he's from. I'm not trying to disparage Bostonians. But he was one of these people that just had to negotiate everything. And I was getting a little tired of it, but the straw that broke the camel's back was on the day of closing, you do a final walkthrough. And oh my goodness, he was nitpicking everything and just, you had a nail in the wall over here and you didn't patch it properly. And it's like, come on. Anyway, and so then at one point he does this we had these beautiful wood blinds on all the windows in the house. And he does this, and he says, "Yeah, the blinds aren't clean. Unless we clean the blinds, the deal's off." And I just looked at him and said, "Then it's off. Get out."
Wow.
Now this was a very expensive house, and the realtors who stood to make quite a bit of commission were just flabbergasted.
Yep,
No. And one of them even said, which I would have led with, I think if it was my sale, no, don't worry about it. We'll clean them, right? And I just was done. I said, no, I'm done. And I looked at him and I said, you clearly by your actions, you don't even want this house. And he's like, oh, I'm done. Get out. And he left. I felt very good about that at the time from a clarity standpoint. In other words, I'm going through cancer treatment, and you know what? I don't have time for this.
Yeah.
I've got better things to do in my life, And I think so. It's like that. That's that clarity that I was talking about in episode 80. But that clarity can come from other things. If you're doing your goals for next year, the person who's facilitating that, and there's many of them out there, will say, take a step back. If you didn't have your current responsibilities, and your time was your own, and you could prioritize what you would do, what would you do? If you had limitless time, what would you do differently? If you could, weren't responsible for these three things that are supposedly taking all your time, what would you do differently? Of course, the follow-on question is, why aren't you doing that now?
Yeah.
And I think that it's a useful exercise. It's, some people say, well, if you won the lottery tomorrow, what would you do? Well, why aren't you doing that now? If you had unlimited resources, what would you do? And so if you had only had 6 months to live, what would you do? What is it? How do you spend your time? And when's the last time you thought about why you're spending your time that way?
Those are good questions.
We often say, well, I have to do this. And of course, no, you don't have to do anything. You get to do something, or you do it because you don't want the consequence of X.
Right.
Right? I tell the story all the time, and my kids used to come to me and say, Well, Dad, I have to go to practice. Well, you don't have to go to practice. You choose to go to practice because you want the consequence of playing in the game on Saturday. So now, what are you doing to make sure that you make practice and that you're prepared and that you're doing all these things? So, you don't have to do anything. So, given that premise, what are you doing with your time?
I will get to that in a second, but I also want to say, if there's an issue of health, I don't want to make this sound like you have got to get on the A train and, be proactive in all these different areas. Sometimes your body cannot. Sometimes your mind cannot. And sometimes you need the rest and you need the mindlessness because of the overwhelming nature of whatever it is that you're facing. And, I think I said to you a few weeks ago, there was a few days that I was binge watching a show.
Exactly.
Is that a good use of time?
It can
No.
be.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, probably not a great use of time. But in that moment when I needed mental rest from thinking all of the thoughts, it was something that was just a pleasurable distraction in the moment. And so I just want to throw that in there as a little bit of an aside because I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. There are physical and mental circumstances where it's just too much and you need to step back. But ultimately, the desire would be to spend our time wisely, whether ample time or a short duration of time, to spend it with purpose.
And I think that that's where it's coming to, is spending it with purpose. And by the way, if you need to do something to stay mentally or physically healthy, then you should do that. Yeah. I mean, that is absolutely a true thing. And if you've got blender brain and you've got 3,000 voices in there that won't be quiet, if binge watching a show for a couple of hours does the trick and helps, and at the end of that, it worked, then that's a very good, I'm like I said, now, if you don't have that and you just like to go spend 3 hours a night on your couch, that's a different story. But back to the intentional use of time with purpose.
Yes.
How do we get there? What's the best thing we should do? What should you be doing with your time?
Yeah. Well, you asked a series of questions a few moments ago, and I think in my push back a little bit, I would say many of the things that you asked kind of are implying that you have the resources to do the things that you might identify on that list. And that may not always be the case.
No,
if you won the lottery or if resource was not a restriction, what would you be doing and why aren't you doing it now? Well, maybe one of the answers is I would travel the world, but that's not economically feasible, for you. Or, I would gift all of these things to all of these people and maybe you just don't have the resources for it. So, of course, being curious about these questions and the exercise that develops into maybe a plan for how you might beneficially spend your time, we have to take into account the resource constraint that may be present.
We can. Now, we can do something about that sometimes. You remember the old urgent and important matrix, right? We often spend our time on urgent things that appear important that are not. And also, so we should be spending time on the important things. So what is important to you and your values, and make sure that you spend the proper amount of time there. If you have children and you're like the average American that spends, 10 minutes a week with them, and you want to intentionally improve or increase that time, that's a very worthwhile thing to be doing to do that. Now, you may say, well, I don't have the time. I'm working, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Well, then that's when you come into the word proactive. And proactive says, in order to keep the urgent from happening, what can you proactively do to get yourself out of that cycle of constantly just being in the waves, bashing in the waves, and then going to the TV.
Yeah.
Right. So you're just going from hard work, burnout almost to crashing in front of the TV.
Yeah.
How can you? And the classic example of dealing with that is, where did the fire detector come from? Where did the smoke detector come from? It came from a fireman who was putting out fires.
Yeah.
So, and that's a good metaphor for our lives. If you don't want to be putting out so many fires, what are you doing to prevent the fires from occurring in the first place? And so any incremental time you have, instead of going to what we used to call quadrant 4, which is unimportant, and non-urgent, what can you do in that important but not urgent sphere that can proactively tamp down and prevent some of those fires from occurring?
Well, that is going to be so unique and so individual, and certainly I don't know that we
Totally.
can come up with even a list of suggestions during the course of this podcast. But yeah, so if you kind of envision what Gary's talking about, the urgent and the necessary,
Important.
as a 4 grid quadrant, so you've got super urgent, super important, up in the upper left, less urgent but still important, not urgent, not important, and then not important but urgent,
Yes.
right? So you can do that exercise. You can just draw that on a piece of paper, do that exercise for yourself, and that will be absolutely independent to you
Yep.
and to your life circumstance. But I like that suggestion. If you've got something in the quadrant of low importance, low urgency, how many of those items can you do something about, delegate it away, create some sort of a stopgap measure, create a solution so that you're buying back that chunk of time that you can redirect it into one of your other boxes. So let's say you've now created a little bit more margin in your day, or you have just been, super intentional, like I'm going to spend quality time with these people or with this circumstance, but then the resource isn't there. I wanted to talk about that scenario because I think it's very real for a lot of people. And I'm thinking, as we talk about oftentimes people with these big desires, when you ask the question, what would you do if resource wasn't an objective? A lot of people would say travel.
Okay.
It's super expensive and it may just be completely unrealistic. And I bring this up as an idea, and I certainly hope this is where I love it when people comment and contribute their ideas, because man, do we need to help each other with creativity and to get those juices flowing and maybe point folks in the right direction of something that they might try. I remember many years ago, pre the notion of being able to afford to visit Europe, that my daughter, we were talking about Paris. So Paris was a highlight of conversation over and over again. And so one day when the girls were, I don't know if they were at school, I don't remember what the circumstance was, but they were gone. I had a little bit of time in the house, and I got these big old butcher paper rolls, and I just, with some really simple paint, like almost finger paints or whatever, just basic paints, drew the Eiffel Tower, drew some skylines, hung some, twinkle lights, and I think I made some sort of a pastry and something else. And so when they got home, we had our little Paris moment out on the back porch.
That's so cool.
It was silly, but it was impactful, and it was time well spent.
Yeah.
And so if you can't afford a $1,500 flight to Paris, plus hotel, plus food, plus all of this stuff, but maybe you've got $25 on craft supplies and baking goods, perhaps you can create your little Paris getaway in your own backyard. And so I think there are opportunities to travel the world, as it were, as best as you are able with the limitations at hand.
Sure. And I think a worthwhile way to be curious about that is, what are you trying to accomplish with your travel? Is it to experience different cultures? I can show you a way to do that right here. Is it to get some downtime away from work? I'm pretty sure you can lock the door and turn your phone off. Right? No, I'm serious.
Yeah,
why do you want to travel? I think we often sometimes just think of things, but we don't understand why we want to do them. And it's a great curiosity question.
Yeah.
Is, okay, well, what is it that I want? Why do I want to travel the world? Is it because I want to have great pictures for Facebook? Right? Is it because everybody else is doing it, so I need to do it and I've got FOMO? Is it because I truly need a break? Because there's other ways to take a break other than travel. Is it because I want to experience different cultures? There's ways you can have exchange students in your house and experience different cultures. We do that.
Yep.
And it's a great way to do that. And I've experienced my best cultural exposure by having someone live in my house.
Interesting.
Right? So I think it's fair to say, well, what is it you want about travel? Or whatever it is that you think you want to do.
Yeah.
Why do you want to do that? What do you hope to get out of it? Is there another way to do that? that doesn't require as many resources or any resources at all?
I've honestly never thought of that question. Why do you want to travel? And I would imagine if you're generating that list of things you would do if you had all the time in the world, all the money in the world, maybe your top 5 of them, to put that question to it, why do you want to do that? If you really boil it down to the heart of the matter, maybe there are some very affordable, realistic ways to accomplish that goal.
Absolutely, and I think travel is but one example. You could do that with almost anything that you feel like, you're getting cheated in life because you can't do this, and it's like, okay, well then, why do you want to do it, and figure out how to do it in a different way.
Off the top of your head, what would you imagine some popular answers would be to the question? If time and resource were a non-issue, what would you do? What was another category that comes to mind?
Helping others, and one that's been on my mind a lot lately is helping people with hope, helping people with establishing a vision for their lives, helping people have peace in the chaos of the world. I see so many people like that. How to have a happy relationship and a happy life. My wife and I right now are doing pre-marriage counseling with a couple that I'm going to officiate in September. And, I just have pure joy when I'm doing that. Now, would I love doing that full time and doing nothing but that?
Probably not.
I'm not sure. I mean, I've thought about it. I love doing that kind of stuff. It just brings me great joy. But you're probably right. I like to have a mixture, a meaningful mix of things that I do in my life. But if someone were to say resources are unlimited, this is the problem for me, is I enjoy what I do for work so much that I'm not sure I would quit work. But it would certainly change my approach to it.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
There might be some things that I wouldn't suffer through, so to
Sure.
speak. There's might be situations and things that I wouldn't put up with. But the point is, I think that helping others is a really good one. Addressing injustice, I think, is another good one. Some people would say buy an RV and travel the country and go to a different campsite every night. More power to them, right? I hope that there's some socialization and some worthiness in that, and some ways to do that. But look, some people literally work for 50 years in their life in order to buy an RV and travel the country. Fine. I mean, that's not me, but that is something that is a goal that some people have.
Well, and then I think that becomes really the time to ask the curious question. And if health or circumstance does not allow you to achieve that goal, would you change your plan?
Exactly, and I think that's a very real thing that we're all going to go through.
Yeah.
Because there's that gap between stopping working for a W-2 and the end of your life, and what are you going to do with that time?
Right.
And I'm shocked at the number of people who are couples that haven't thought about that. And by the way, when you don't discuss it, by definition, you've got divergent views. Hopefully they're not too divergent.
Right.
I just recently had a situation with a couple who, in their 50s, and one said, oh, well, we're getting a fishing cabin on the lake, and the other one's like, oh, hell no, we're going between our different grandchildren and just going visiting. And it's like, what?
You guys have never discussed this?
You've never discussed this prior to now? Or they realize that it was. Sometimes you get in relationships where you just don't bring things up because you don't want the controversy or the pain.
Ooh, that's a rough one.
I didn't intend to go there. I'm just saying it would be good if your intentions were aligned with your life partner on what you're going to do in that gap between. So we're talking about spending your time intentionally.
Yep.
If you have a goal, and which is a good thing to have, then it makes it real easy to spend your time intentionally on that. There's a principle that says that it's easy to say no if you have a bigger yes. So there's a lot of times we start doing something and we just feel like, well, we're just going to do that the rest of our lives. or we are in something that we just don't say no to because people ask us to do it and we just say yes. Well, guess what? It's easy to say no to something if you've got a bigger burning yes. And one of the best ways to establish that bigger burning yes is to investigate what you're passionate about, investigate what your goals are, investigate what you intentionally want to be doing,
Yeah.
and make a big yes. Make a wild, hairy, audacious goal or some big thing, that vision that you want to do in your life, and make sure you're working towards it.
That's good. But then I'm going to circle back to that question that we came up with at the beginning of this episode, the why behind it.
That's
So
right.
if your goal is a fishing cabin and to be left alone for the last 15 years of your life, why?
Why is that? You feel like you've contributed enough in this world and you've put up with enough terrible people and you just want to be by yourself with fish. Again, not something that's clear to me, but if somebody said, yeah, that's my choice and here's why, and they could articulate it and they intend to be happy doing it, fair play to you.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? But I mean, I think that the point here is don't drift through life and get caught up in stuff and then look back and go, why did I do all that?
Right.
And I didn't even like it.
Yep. Classic Cats in the Cradle song, right?
Exactly.
If you don't know what I'm talking about, go listen to it and you will cry at the end.
Yes. Or in the middle.
Or in the middle. Yeah, but precisely that. You know, we have these plans, we have these intentions, and maybe they're literally a plan. We've executed steps to achieve a goal. Perhaps it's gone that far, but we never know the guarantee of time. If that plan is dependent on you working 30 years in this industry, retiring with this amount of money in the bank, and then you've got the last 15 years to do X, you're not guaranteed those 15 years. You're not guaranteed any of those things. And so if you know that there's a potential for that to be derailed, does it change your plan?
Right.
You know, if you have no assurance that you can execute on that plan, does it change the crafting of the plan, and does it change the way that you spend your time now and looking ahead? And I think these are all great, curious questions to ask.
And what your plan B is there, but have a plan.
Yeah.
I think I don't know when the last time we talked about this, but you know, if you're flying from here to Hawaii, the plane is off track 80% of the time, but it has a clear goal.
Yes.
And so it has a navigation system that gets it back on track, and it eventually makes it there on time. Although these days, planes are often late, but at least you get there.
Gary.
Yeah, that's right. But at least you get there. And so don't be the person who's like the Cheshire Cat with Alice, who says, she says, well, which way should I go? He says, well, where are you trying to get to? And I don't know. Well, then it doesn't matter, right? So be intentional, and that's how you figure out how to spend your time, and you will naturally gravitate towards spending your time on the things that get you closer to that intentional life.
I like it. All right. Well, speaking of time, that's about it for our time today. But as always, we welcome your feedback. So you can hit us up at curiositynotjudgment.com. You can leave comments here or on any of the podcast platforms that you are listening on. And we will catch up with you next week.
Take care.